Welcome back. We're here with Rahim Mohamed, a journalist with the National Post, who has written extensively on the proliferation of fentanyl superlabs in Canada. Now, Rahim, when did we start to actually see the emergence of these superlabs, and what were the underlying factors that drove their ascent?
Sure. So you can look at the fentanyl crisis in Canada in two waves. One, broadly speaking, I'd mark between around 2015 to 2019. At that time, you were seeing a ton of finished fentanyl flow into ports of entry in the Pacific via China. It was part of a broader organized crime issue involving China that also involved things like money laundering. So Sam Cooper's a journalist who's done a lot of information on those connections and the role of Chinese organized crime in the sort of beginnings of the fentanyl crisis here in Canada. But the period of time in which superlabs began to come to the fore again, principally in British Columbia in Alberta. It started in 2019 when the Trump administration did exert some pressure on China over fentanyl, and China banned exports of finished fentanyl, but it wasn't able to quite crack down, or chose not to crack down on the exports of fentanyl precursors. So kind of from 2019 onward, you saw a shift from kind of the finished product flowing into Canada via China to several of the precursors flowing in from China, and those precursors being assembled in these super labs within Canada. That only began to ramp up during the COVID lockdown, where trade period and the flow of a lot of goods across borders became restricted, not just from China to Canada, from the United States to Canada, and any sort of international boundaries. So kind of during that lockdown period, from March 2020, through to 2022, that's when you saw these super labs really ramp up. And I think that is when, unfortunately, you saw a crisis on the demand side, where legitimate issues were coupled with the types of alienation and isolation and loneliness and psychological issues a lot of us were dealing with during that lockdown period. So that was, you had a process that was sped up by a heightening of demand within Canada. And I would also add to the mix a number of decriminalization and deregulation efforts that we can say were largely failed. So you had a
Mhm.
major pilot ramp up in British Columbia around the start of the pandemic in March of 2020, which we're now seeing
Mhm.
is associated with an uptick in the consumption of illicit opioids leading to fentanyl.
Now, Rahim, obviously the Canadian government has made a few grievous mistakes when it comes to policy. And we've seen that the United States has now raised concerns about Canada's superlabs and has cited them as justification for potentially imposing 25% tariffs on Canadian imports. Can you give us a more detailed explanation of what American authorities think about this issue in about 90 seconds?
Sure. The general consensus is the vast majority of product that is being produced at these super labs is being consumed within Canada. We're still very much in the throes of our own fentanyl crisis. It's challenging to assess the American claims because fentanyl is such a potent substance. About 2 milligrams can be fatal to you and me. A relatively small amount crossing the Canada-U.S. border, can mean millions of doses. So I think it was around 40 pounds last year, intercepted by American border agents at the northern border, which doesn't sound like a ton to you and me, but if you consider that that 2 pounds can translate roughly into 500,000 doses. That's millions of doses potentially flowing into places like Montana, places like Washington State, places across the border that are dealing themselves with substantial fentanyl and opioid problems. So the American claim is hard to validate. I think some of the subsequent actions of the Trump administration have shown that they're acting in less than good faith. But it's undeniable that at least some of the fentanyl and other synthetic opioids that have been produced in these Canadian superlabs have been ending up at the Canada-U.S. border, although the bulk of which has still been consumed within Canada. There's enough domestic demand within Canada to keep the enterprises flowing.
So we can see that these super labs have been hooking a large number of Canadians into addiction. And we'll be talking more about how Canada is trying to stop that when we get back after the break.